2. The Elephant in the Dark. A man, never having seen water, is thrown blindfolded into it and feels it. When the bandage is removed, he knows what it is. Until then, he only knew it by its effect. Rumi, fihi ma fihi. With the expansion of science and the arts in medieval Saracendom, the Sufi genius asserted itself when Sufis became physicians and scientists, and left symbols in their buildings and decorative art, some of them are nowadays called arabesques, which were designed to maintain, in visible form, certain eternal truths believed by the Sufis to summarize the human soul in search of, and in progress toward, final harmony and integration with all creation. It baffles some 20th century scientists to know that, almost 1,000 years before Einstein, the dervish Hujwiri was in technical literature discussing the identity of time and space in applied Sufi experience. Revelation of the Veiled, recapitulation of their miracles. The results of the intensely practical system of the Sufis, though often obscure to outsiders through ignorance of the system's real meaning, are to be found throughout the thinking, the art, and the magico-occult phenomena of the East and West alike. Approaching closer to the Sufic experience, we must glimpse the methods of thinking and the basic ideas of these mystics. We could start with a poem, a joke, a symbol. The pathways into Sufic thinking are, it is traditionally said, almost as varied as the number of Sufis in existence. Religion, for instance, cannot be accepted or rejected out of hand until the student knows exactly what religion means. The essential unity of all religious faith is not agreed on throughout the world, say the Sufis, because most of the believers are not at all aware as to what religion itself essentially is. It does not have to be what it is generally assumed to be. To the Sufi, the religionist and scoffer are like a believer in the flatness of the earth arguing with one who holds that it is cylindrical in shape. Neither has any real experience of it. This brings out a fundamental difference between the method of the Sufis and that of other metaphysical systems. It is too often taken for granted that a person must either be a believer or an unbeliever, or perhaps an agnostic. If a believer, he will expect to be offered a faith or a system which seems to him to fulfill what he thinks are his needs. Few people tell him that he may not understand what his needs are. The Sufi's world has extra dimensions. To him, things are meaningful in a sense which they are not to people who follow only the training which is imposed upon them by ordinary society. Such people squint. A hungry man asked to total 2 and 2 will answer 4 or even 8 loaves of bread. The totality of life cannot be understood, so runs Sufi teaching, if it is studied only through the methods which we use in everyday living. This is partly because, although the question, "What is it all about?" can of course be posed in a nominally reasonable sequence of words, the answer is not to be expressed in a similar way. It comes through experience and enlightenment. An instrument which can assess a small thing cannot necessarily assess a large thing. Practice your knowledge, for knowledge without practice is a body without life. Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa is the founder of one of the 4 great Islamic schools of law, the 4th school. He was the Sufi teacher of Daud of Tai, died 781. Daud passed on his teachings to his disciple Maruf Kaki, Solomon the King, the founder of the Sufi fraternity called the Builders. A scientist may tell you that space and time are the same thing, or that matter is not solid at all. He may be able to prove it by his own methods. This, however, will make little difference to your understanding, and none at all to your experience, of what all this involves. All matter is infinitely divisible, shall we say? But for most practical purpose there is a limit to the number of divisions which you can make of a piece of chocolate, if it is still to function as you expect a piece of chocolate to function. So, on the one hand you may be looking at a piece of chocolate, on the other an object which you want to divide into as many pieces as possible. The human mind tends to generalize from partial evidence. The Sufis believe that they can experience something more complete. A traditional Sufi story illuminates this question in one of its aspects, and shows the difficulties which beset even scholars when they approach the Sufis with a view to understanding them by limited methods of study. An elephant, belonging to a travelling exhibition, had been stabled near a town where no elephant had been seen before. 4 curious citizens, hearing of the hidden wonder, went to see if they could get a preview of it. When they arrived at the stable, they found that there was no light. The investigation, therefore, had to be carried out in the dark. One, touching its trunk, thought that the creature must resemble a hose-pipe. The second felt an ear and concluded that it was a fan. The third, feeling a leg, could liken it only to a living pillar, and when the fourth put his hand on its back, he was convinced that it was some kind of throne. None could form the complete picture, and of the part which each felt, he could only refer to it in terms of things which he already knew. The result of the expedition was confusion. Each was sure that he was right. None of the other townspeople could understand what had happened, what the investigators had actually experienced. The average person, wanting to inform himself as to what the Sufis' thinking is, will normally address himself to reference books. He may look up the word Sufi in an encyclopedia, or have recourse to books by scholars of various kinds, experts in religion and mysticism. If he does so, he will find a most admirable example of the elephant in the dark mentality. According to one Persian scholar, Sufism is a Christian aberration. A professor at Oxford thinks that it is influenced by the Hindu Vedanta. An Arab-American professor speaks of it as a reaction against intellectualism in Islam. A professor of Semitic literature claims traces of Central Asian shamanism. A German will have us find in it Christianity plus Buddhism. 2 very great English Orientalists put their money on a strong Neoplatonic influence, yet one of them will concede that it was perhaps independently generated. An Arab, publishing his opinions through an American university, assures his readers that Neoplatonism, which he invokes as a Sufic ingredient, is itself Greek plus Persian. One of the greatest Spanish Arabists, while claiming an initiation of Christian monasticism, plumps for Manichaeism as a Sufi source. Another academician of no less repute finds Gnosticism among the Sufis, while the English professor, who is the translator of a Sufistic book, prefers to think of it as a little Persian sect. But another translator finds the mystical tradition of the Sufis in the Quran itself. Although the numerous definitions of Sufism which occur in Arabic and Persian books on the subject are historically interesting, their chief importance lies in showing that Sufism is undefinable. Professor R. A. Nicholson, The Mystics of Islam, London, 1914, page 25. A Pakistani view of Rumi, 1207 to 1273, considers him the heir of virtually all the great currents of ancient thought as represented in the Near East. To those who have been in real contact with Sufis and who have attended their meetings, no mental adjustment or effort of will is needed to consider Sufism as containing within itself the myriad threads which appear in such non-Sufi systems as Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Aristotelianism, and so on. Numberless waves lapping and momentarily reflecting the sun, all from the same sea, says the master Halki. The mind which has, on the other hand, been coached to believe in the distinctiveness or monopoly of ideas of certain schools will not easily be able to bring this synthesizing understanding into the contemplation of Sufism. Dr. Khalifa Abdul Hakim shows that he is able to refer to all the philosophical schools whose ideas are shared with Rumi, without being compelled to consider one as derived from the other. He says, "His Mathnavi is a crystal of many facets. In it we see reflected the broken lights of Semitic monotheism, Greek intellectualism, Plato's theory of ideas, and Aristotle's theory of causation and development, the one of Plotinus and the ecstasy that unites with the one, the controversial questions of the Mutakalimun, schoolmen, the Erkenntnis theoretisch problems of Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, Ghazali's theory of prophetic consciousness, and Ibn al-Arabi's monism." Which does not mean to imply, if my position is not yet clear, that Rumi has concocted a system of mysticism out of the above ingredients. Pears are not found only in Samarkand. The world literature on Sufism is large. A great number of Sufi texts have been translated by Western scholars. Few, if any, have had the advantage of experiencing Sufism, or knowing its oral law, or even the order in which its formal material is studied. That is not to say that their labours have not been very much worthwhile. They have been most useful to the Orientalist, but may tend to be incoherent. Like the legendary scribe who had to accompany his letter and read it himself because of its illegibility, many of these works need a Sufi's commentary. The effect of the translations and discursive books on Sufism upon the uninitiated student must be remarkable, and certainly will not be easily forgotten. The method of approaching the question of translations has its quaintnesses. Setting aside the matter of differences between translators in matters of accuracy and meaning, which have caused much feline, though really irrelevant, activity among them, we find that the literary material offered to the captive reader in translated form may undergo strange adventures. Sometimes attempts are made to reproduce in English the cadence or the original rhymes of Eastern poetry, because the translator feels that this device helps to convey the sense of the original. But other translators hold the opposite view and eschew any attempt to reproduce metre, because they claim that it is impossible of attainment or otherwise undesirable. Some texts, again, are translated with the aid of non-Sufi, generally Muslim, even formal Christian theological, commentaries. Then there are the partial translations, selectively presented, having suffered excisions which the translator somehow considers himself entitled to make. The less he knows about the practices of the Sufi, the braver these mutilations seem to be. Yet Sufi writings are never solely literary, philosophical, or technical material. There is a translation of a Persian book into English, not from Persian, but from a French translation of an Urdu rendering of a classical Persian abridgment of an Arabic original. There are modern versions of Persian classics, sometimes edited to remove references offensive to current Iranian religious beliefs. Add to these the works of Christian missionary, Hindu and Western neo-Hindu, and Western neo-Sufi, non-academic writers and popularizers. The presentation of Sufism to the average literate man in a Western language reveals a condition of literature which is perhaps unmatched in any other field. This kaleidoscopic process has its own special incidental delights. The warping tendency, to find a term for which seems impossible unless it be polychotomy, on the pattern of dichotomy, had in fact reached an amusing point nearly 1,000 years ago. This was when the Jewish thinker Avicebron of Malaga, circa 1020 to circa 1050 or 70, wrote The Fount of Life, a book based upon Sufi Illuministic philosophy. Because he wrote in Arabic, many authoritative Christians of the Northern European school, then imbibing Arab learning, thought that he was an Arab. Some at least considered that he was a Christian, sound in doctrine, and they said so. The Franciscans accepted his teachings, which they eagerly transmitted into the Christian stream of thought, having culled them from a Latin translation made about a century after Avicebron's death. A lady of academic distinction who has written authoritatively on Middle Eastern mysticism has felt more than one part of the elephant, for in one and the same book she says Sufism might have been directly affected by Buddhistic ideas, and that the earliest Sufis can have had little contacts with Hellenistic literature of any kind, yet their ideas were derived from Hellenistic sources. Then she ends her study of the Sufic way with the decision that its real origin and source are to be found in the age-long desire of the human soul for God. Sufi activity has had a considerable influence upon the Christian West, so much so that a better-than-average case could be made out for the Sufi assertion that objective truth contains within it a dynamic which can hardly be gainsaid. This vitalistic force, however, depends for its correct expression upon correct alignment of the human receptor. If this preparation is absent, the Sufic current is liable to take a peculiar turn. Especially susceptible to this warping is the elective or fragmentary handling of the Sufi stream. An excellent illustration might be made from the fate of Ghazali's work in Europe. Ghazali of Central Asia, 1058 to 1111, wrote a book called Destruction of the Philosophers, which was soon translated in part and used by Catholic apologists against Muslim and Christian schools alike. The portion which came into the hands of the West, however, was only that part which was devoted to a preparatory exposition of philosophy. Ghazali's Sufi works have to be read as a whole, and his opinions about the value of Sufic exercises must also be followed if he is to be understood aright. This book, however, was answered by another Arab, Ibn Rushd of Cordoba, 1126 to 1198. Under the name Averroes, he too was translated. He did not succeed in refuting Ghazali at all by his scholastic methods, but thought that he had done so. Yet Averroism dominated Western and Christian scholastic thought for no fewer than 400 years, from the 12th to the end of the 16th century. Taken together, Ghazali's fragments and Averroes' Aristotelianism constituted a double Sufic current, action and reaction, which nurtured a Christendom wholly ignorant, as far as scholastics were concerned, of the initiating cause of both Ghazalism and Averroism. It is necessary to note, says Rumi, that opposite things work together, even though nominally opposed. Fihi ma fihi. The fundamental Sufi awareness that Sufism is both a teaching and a part of an organic evolution is seldom shared by those who make it their concern to attempt a study of the system. There is consequently almost no possibility that the outsider will be able to form accurate conclusions. Relying upon his discursive faculty alone, he is incapacitated before he begins. It is the externalist of today, as much as of yesterday, whom Rumi addresses in his Mathnavi. Danand o ki nabacht wa muharram ast, ziraki as iblis wa ishq adam ast, which is to the effect that he who is fortunately enlightened, the Sufi, knows that sophistry is from the devil and love from Adam. If the Sufis confuse the scholar by their seeming inconsistencies, and sometimes cause him to hedge his conclusions with too many qualifications to be of great value, they can rouse the theologian to holy wrath. Love, an active principle of Sufic development and experience, the mechanism and the goal alike, cannot be admitted as genuine. The Reverend Professor W. R. Inge, in Christian Mysticism, hastens to hurl himself at what he takes to be the target. The Sufis, or Mohammedan mystics, use erotic language very freely and appear, like true Asiatics, to have attempted to give a sacramental or symbolic character to the indulgence of their passions. This classic sample conjures up visions of certain Western scholars who have embraced Sufism, revealing them to be imitation Asiatics addicted to erotic language, in secret, for they do not publish it, which itself covers up the indulgence of their passions. They, in turn, might be able to comfort themselves with the opinion of a Cambridge professor who sees Sufism, more respectably, as the development of the primordial religion of the Aryan race. And if Sufi symbolism is not in fact such, but rather represents experiences actually lived, then we might well find that the Sufis are even more versatile than their staunchest supporters know. The Sufi literalist would be able to swallow 100 oceans, worship idols while not worshipping them, travel to China in a state of drunkenness, being in the world and yet not of it all the while, not to mention his 100 moons and suns. Advocates of a literal interpretation of mystical expressions are, of course, already adequately answered by such specialists as Evelyn Underhill. Symbol, the clothing which the spiritual borrows from the material plane, is a form of artistic expression. That is to say, it is not literal but suggestive, though the artist who used it may sometimes lose sight of this distinction. Hence the persons who imagine that the spiritual marriage of St. Catherine or St. Teresa veils a perverted sexuality, that the vision of the Sacred Heart involved an incredible anatomical experience, or that the divine inebriation of the Sufis is the apotheosis of drunkenness, do but advertise their ignorance of the mechanism of the arts, like the lady who thought that Blake must be mad because he said that he had touched the sky with his finger. Mysticism, London, 1911, New York, 1960. It must be admitted that it is easier for the scholar to approach and describe one aspect of the elephant in the dark than it is for him to form a coherent outside view of Sufism. Many scholars suffer from a psychological incapacity to handle this theme. Apart from incapacity itself, says Ghazali, other shortcomings prevent the reaching of inner truth. One such is knowledge acquired by external means. Alchemy of Happiness. In addition to the unscalable wall of Sufi experience, there is the problem of the Sufi personality. Any ordinary survey of Sufic writings and careers would be enough to bewilder the least doctrinaire investigator. Among the Sufis have been former Zoroastrian, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist and other priests, Persians, Greeks and Arabs, Egyptians, Spaniards and Englishmen. There are in the ranks of the Sufi masters theologians, a reformed captain of banditti, slaves, soldiers, merchants, viziers, kings and artists. Only two are well known to many contemporary Western readers. They are the poet and mathematician Omar Khayyam of Persia, and the Prince Abu Ben Adam of Afghanistan, the subject of a poem by Leigh Hunt. Abu Ben Adam, may his tribe increase. Among those directly influenced by Sufism, we can name at random Raymond Lully, Goethe, President de Gaulle, and Dag Hammarskjöld of the United Nations. Writing often under threat of inquisitorial persecution, Sufis have prepared books reconciling their practices with orthodoxy and defending the use of fanciful imagery. In order to obscure the meanings of ritualistic factors, or for the necessary purpose of appearing mere compilers of Sufi compendiums, They have handed down manuscripts from which the Sufic essence is to be distilled only by those who have the necessary equipment. Adapting their workings to different places, epochs, and temperaments, they have in turn stressed the roles of asceticism, piety, music and movement, solitude and gregariousness. Only the respectably religious of the Sufi manuals are available outside Sufi circles. That a person may be completely ignorant of the coherence behind Sufi teaching and yet appreciate the work of its great poets has been demonstrated again and again by translators. Gertrude Bell, an indefatigable student and translator into English of the great Hafiz, was hailed by the Orientalist Sir Denison Ross for her scholarship and judgment. Yet she is the first to admit that exactly on what grounds he, Hafiz, is appreciated in the East it is difficult to determine, and what his compatriots make of his teaching it is perhaps impossible to understand. Khaja Shamsuddin Hafiz, literally Master Son of Faith, the Protector, he who knows the Quran by heart, died in 1389. One of the greatest of all Persian poets, his works are known as the Interpreter of the Secrets and the Speech of the Invisible. His collection, the Divan, conceals in seemingly sensual verse many Sufi experiences. It is used as a textbook, and also, by the vulgar, for omens by opening it at random. Originating in Isfahan, the family migrated to Shiraz. The date of his death is concealed in a poem which appears on his tomb, which itself gives the clue to the fact that it is concealed in the numerical cipher used by the Sufis. If thou wouldst know when he sought a place in the dust of Musala, seek the date in the dust of Musala. Dust of Musala, Kaki Musala, decodes to the numbers 791, the equivalent in the Muslim calendar for the year 1389. Hafiz was the teacher of kings, and at the same time beloved of the people. His influence is still second to none in Persian literature. This makes all the more interesting her shot in the dark, when she tries to form some opinion as to what Hafiz really is getting at. From our point of view, then, the sum of his philosophy seems to be that there is little of which we can be certain. That little must always be the object of all men's desire. Each of us will set out upon the search for it along a different road, and none will find his road easy to follow. Each may, if he be wise, discover compensations for his toil by the wayside. G. L. Bell, Poems from the Divan of Hafiz, London, New Edition, 1928, page 81. She does not see the Sufi activity as a process, as the Sufis see it, but could not fail to glimpse the strange and wholly Sufic character of Hafiz in speaking of, and seeing, a panorama of human thought in what is to us the present, and was of course to him the distant future. It is as if his mental eye, endowed with wonderful acuteness of vision, had penetrated into those provinces of thought which we of a later age were destined to inhabit. Ibid. Hafiz's prescience was too evident to be missed, but it was also startling. She can come to no conclusion about it. To return to our elephant, the scholars are happily much less doctrinaire than the ecclesiastics. For the Sufis, both resemble the visitors to the elephant's house. Is it possible that they have indeed all seen a part of the parts? The Sufis say, "This is not a religion, it is religion," and Sufism is the essence of all religions. Is there, then, among the Sufis and elsewhere, a tradition that there is a secret doctrine passed down by initiation and preserved by a chain of succession, which might account for the outside observer, according to his prejudice, seeing almost every form of religion among the writings of the Sufis? In order to determine this, we shall have to refer to the opinions of the Sufis on this point, which has generally been disregarded by non-Sufi students, and also follow the traditions of other schools, as well as the transmission in the Middle Ages and other times of a belief in an inner teaching beyond formalized religion. The search is by no means an uninteresting one. Formerly, according to the Sheikh Abu al-Hasan Fushanji, being a Sufi was a reality without a name. Today it is a name without a reality. This statement, taken at face value, is generally considered to mean that people calling themselves Sufis abounded, while the real pursuit of the Sufis was not understood. And although this too might be an interpretation of the saying, it is here intended to clarify a completely different point. The urge to trace a historical phenomenon to definite beginnings, so well marked in the present phase of learning, is undoubtedly bound up with the need of the ordinary mind to have a beginning and, if possible, an end for everything. Almost everything known to man through his ordinary senses has for him a beginning and an end. To know what something is gives a sensation of stability, a feeling of security. The label has been stuck on the book, now it can be placed on the shelf, the A to Z of something or other. There are various more or less accepted methods of establishing beginnings and endings, or creating substitutes for them. They may be created by concocted myths and legends, which often deal with how things started and how they will finish. Another way is that of the Chinese emperor who decreed that history would start with him, and that all earlier books should be destroyed. A third technique is to assume that a certain event, located in time and perhaps in space, represents a beginning. This was generally the religious way, and it is very strongly marked in familiar Christianity, whose official dogma depends on it, St. Augustine notwithstanding. The belief that a certain unique religious event brought about a complete change in human destiny released within Christendom a great force of energy, but at least two factors seriously limited its effect. The first was time, which in the event showed that there was a limit to the natural and even artificial expansion of church Christianity, and a limit to its dynamic within its own domain. The other was a scholastic problem. Because the teaching of Jesus was held to be unique, although perhaps foreshadowed and foretold in prophecy, it was difficult to attain a spiritual perspective which was not conditioned by this belief. Religion, mysticism, spirituality could not now easily be looked upon as a natural development or a common possession of mankind. According to the Sufis, the main counterbalance to the power of formalized Christianity was the continued experience of the real tradition of which it is a distortion. Before even the 10th century, when Islam possessed the most powerful culture and expanding civilization of the known world, the theory of a secret doctrine, a teaching which had been cherished from the earliest times, had made its way from this center of gravity to the West. The first and most powerful classical Sufi school in Europe was found in Spain well over 1,000 years ago. Sufis accompanied the Arab armies which conquered Spain in 711 AD. The tradition was not, as might be thought, invented in the West to account for the ascendancy of the Arabized countries. It fitted in well enough with, and was even incidentally encouraged by, Islam, which view of religion we have noticed as also that of a continuous process represented in every community. It existed in the Far East, and it would awaken a response in the hearts of those who still retained memories of earlier spiritual teachings. It was, in part, the theory of theosophy, which accounted for different religious manifestations among communities, which, according to doctrinaire religion of another brand, should not exist at all. This sense of the unity of inner, experiential or symbolic religion was undoubtedly at work in the days when the peoples of the ancient world equated each other's gods one with the other. Mercury with Hermes, Hermes with Thoth are examples. And it is this theosophical theory which the Sufis consider to be their own tradition, though not limited to the religious domain. Hence, as the Sufi has it, I am in the pagan. I worship at the altar of the Jew. I am the idol of the Yemenite, the actual temple of the fire worshipper, the priest of the Magian, the inner reality of the cross-legged Brahmin meditating, the brush and the colour of the artist, the suppressed, powerful personality of the scoffer. One does not supersede the other. When a flame is thrown into another flame, they join at the point of flameness. You throw a torch at a candle, and then you say, "See, I have annihilated the candle's flame." Ishan Kaiser in Speech of the Sages. The Sufis use a new point of view in order to overcome the conditioning which materialistic, one-sided society has imposed. All philosophy has been cheapened because the teaching of wisdom has become capsulated. People endlessly repeat truisms to one another, without really experiencing what they mean. If a Sufi says, "What is needed is a new approach," it is by no means unlikely that everyone who hears him will at once agree, because the statement sounds significant, and will immediately forget all about it. The meaning of the words has not sunk in. Take the wheat, not the measure in which it is contained. Rumi, Mathnavi, Book 2. So important is it to free the thinking from the adhesions of rigid thinking that the great Rumi has started both of his major works with exercises in this process. In this sense, he keeps pace with the procedure which is normally followed in Sufi teaching schools, and, though the externalist translators probably do not know it, 2 of his books are in fact commentaries upon the stages and states of the Sufic development as manifested in the flesh in a Sufi school. In Fihi ma Fihi, at the very beginning, Rumi takes a saying of Muhammad which has passed into common speech and become a proverb, sagely passed from lip to lip. Muhammad is reported as having said, "The worst of sages is a visitor of princes. The best of princes is a visitor of sages." Rumi points out that the inner meaning of this teaching is that the meaning of visiting depends upon the quality of the visitor and the visited. If a great sage visits a prince, it is the prince who benefits. Hence he is to be considered as having himself visited the sage. This is very far from being a mere juggling with words, as some less reflective people have supposed. With what amounts to shock tactics, the Mathnavi opens its teaching, after the celebrated Song of the Reed, with what looks like a fairy tale about a prince out hunting and a beautiful girl. As the audience settles down to enjoy the conventional story, Rumi starts to manipulate it to create thought in the mind and to combat the tendency to sleep, which is sophistically taken to be the usual reaction to folk tales. A prince, out hunting, saw on the road a beautiful handmaiden. He fell in love with her and bought her. Soon afterward she became ill. In desperation, the potentate offered his doctors anything they might desire of worldly goods to cure her. They were unable to do so, and the girl's condition became worse. The prince, utterly distraught with love and fear, ran to a mosque and implored divine aid. He saw a vision in which an ancient assured him that a physician would soon appear. The following day, as predicted, this personage arrived. The doctor looked at the girl and realized that every remedy tried by the leeches had been useless and worse. He understood that her illness was concerned with her inward condition. Adopting a psychological method, he asked her questions and made her talk, until he discovered that she was in love with a certain goldsmith of Samarkand. He told the prince that a cure would be effected by bringing the goldsmith to the girl's bedside, and he agreed. The goldsmith, for his own part, saw in the prince's summons only a recognition of his own importance in goldsmithing. He did not realize what his fate was to be. When he arrived, they were married, and the girl recovered completely. Thus far, the anodyne of the story may well have taken effect upon the audience, who surrender themselves to the delights of all being well that ends well. But the physician now prepared medicine for the goldsmith, a medicine which made his inner faults so evident that the maiden saw him as he was and started to hate him. He died, and the girl was able to love the prince, who was always intended for her. Apart from the complicated imagery of the tale in the original, the teaching contains an impact at many levels. It is not just a matter of telling a tale with one crude moral. It is a commentary upon some of the processes of life. Hadrat-i Pagman says of this story, "Ponder it, for unless you feel it through, you will be like the little child who wants everything right and cries when things do not seem to be right. You will make a prison for yourself, a prison of emotion. When you are in this prison, you will hurt yourself on the sharpness of the bars which you have yourself arranged." Formerly, Sufi ideas and teachings were actually lived, and there could be a Sufi without a name for his cult. Then came the modern period, in which the name exists, but the living of it is difficult, and has had to be adapted to the veiling, conditioning, which starts in the cradle and ends almost in the grave. Exactly how old is the word Sufism? There were Sufis at all times and in all countries, says the tradition. Sufis existed as such and under this name before Islam. But if there was a name for the practitioner, there was no name for the practice. The English word Sufism is anglicised from the Latin Sufismus. It was a Teutonic scholar who, as recently as 1821, coined the Latinization which is now almost naturalized into English. Before him there was the word tasawwuf, the state, practice, or condition of being a Sufi. This may not seem an important point, but to the Sufis it is. It is one reason why there is no static term in use among Sufis for their cult. They call it a science, an art, a knowledge, a way, a tribe, even by a 10th century portmanteau term, perhaps translatable as psychoanthropology, nafsaniyat al-insaniyat, but they do not call it Sufism. Tariqa Sufiya stands for the Sufi way, and makes a good English parallel, because tariqa stands for path, as well as a way of doing something, and also conveys the notion of following a path, a line or streak, the path of the Sufi. Sufism is referred to by different names in accordance with the sense in which it is being discussed. Thus, Ilm al-Marifat, the science of knowing, may be found, or al-Irfan, the gnosis, and the organized orders or groups tend to be called the Tariqa. Similarly, the Sufi is known as the seeker, the drunken man, the enlightened one, the good, the friend, the near one, the dervish, a fakir, humble, poor in spirit, or kalanda, knower, gnostic, wise, lover, esoterist. Because there would be no Sufism without the Sufis, the word always applies to people and cannot be considered as an abstract form, as, say, philology or communism could mean respectively the study of words or a theory of communalist action. Sufism, then, involves the body of the Sufis as well as the actual practice of their cult. It cannot really mean any theoretical presentation of the way of the Sufis. There is no theoretical or intellectual Sufism, any more than there can be a Sufi movement, which latter is a redundancy, because all Sufic being is movement, and a movement embracing all phenomena of a similar kind. There are, for instance, Christian Sufis, a phrase which could be used, and has been used, by Sufis in general. The Sufi is even called Masihi-i Batini, esoteric Christian, in some connections. If a Sufi were to present to a conventionally cataloguing mind certain facts about the Sufis, a mental or electrical computer might well wreck itself in the attempt to work them into some kind of system. Fortunately, however, there are still numbers of people who can accept information on various levels, and who will be able to form a pattern out of them. Here is a series of facts about the Sufis. The Sufis appear in historical times mainly within the pale of Islam. They have produced many great theologians, poets, scientists. They accepted atomic theory and formulated a science of evolution over 600 years before Darwin. They have been hailed as saints, executed and persecuted as heretics. They teach that there is only one underlying truth within everything that is called religion. Some have said, "I believe in nothing." Others, "I believe in everything." Some say, "Let there be no levity among Sufis." Others, "There is no Sufi without humour." Scholasticism and mysticism are opposed to one another, but the Sufis gave rise to, among others, a school of each. Were these Muslim schools? No, they were Christian, associated with the Augustinians and St. John of the Cross, as Professor Palacios and others have established. From being an Oriental mystic, the Sufi now appears as the antecessor of Catholic mystics and philosophers. Let us add a few more facts. The coffee which we drink was traditionally first used by Sufis to heighten awareness. We wear their clothes, shirt, belt, trousers. We listen to their music, Andalusian, measured music, love songs. Dance their dances, waltz, Morris dancing. Read their stories, Dante, Robinson Crusoe, Chaucer, William Tell. Employ their esoteric phrases, moment of truth, human spirit, ideal man, and play their games, cards. The tarot cards, from which European playing cards are derived, were introduced into the West in 1379. According to Feliciano Bussi, a chronicler is quoted as saying, "In the year 1379 was brought into Viterbo the game of cards, which comes from Sarracenia and is called by them naib." Naib is an Arabic word meaning deputy, and the material from which the tarot cards were copied is still extant. It is deputy or substitute material, forming an allegory of the teachings of a Sufi master about certain cosmic influences upon humanity. This is divided into 4 sections, called the Turuk, 4 ways, the word from which tarot is undoubtedly derived. The Spanish word nape, card, is undoubtedly from the Arabic naib. The tarot now known in the West has been influenced by a Kabbalistic and Judaizing process designed to bring it into line with certain doctrines not implicit in the original. Superficial attempts to link these cards with those in use in Persia or China have not succeeded, because the essential cipher element contained in the meanings of the suits and the trumps is still a Sufi property. The pack, as it stands today, is only partially correct, because there have been transpositions of the significances of some of the atous, the trumps or emblematic figures of the pack. This error has been caused by a mistranslation from Arabic of certain words, due to literal conversion into a different culture system. Another factor may be substitution of one picture for another one. This is not a subject upon which I may be much more explicit. Temperance is incorrectly portrayed and interpreted. So is the 15th trump. The meaning of the 16th trump is a classic case of misunderstanding of a word. The 20th is wrongly emphasized. Many of the attributions, however, are still in use among the Sufis, though in the West the essential associations with Sufi texts have been lost. We even belong to the derivations of their societies, such as Freemasonry and certain chivalric orders. Such Sufic elements are examined at a later stage in this book. The monk in his cell, the fakir on the mountaintop, the merchant in his shop, the king on his throne, these can be Sufis, but this is not Sufism. The Sufi tradition has it that Sufism is a leaven, Sufism is yeast within all human society. If it has never been removed from the field of academic study, this is because it was never made available to scholasticism as a subject of investigation. Its very diversity prevents it from being systematized in the semi-permanent manner which would make it static enough to investigate. Sufism, according to the Sufi, is an adventure in living, necessary adventure. If Sufism is an adventure, a goal of human perfection attained by reviewing and awakening within humanity a higher organ of fulfillment, completion, destiny, why is it so difficult to assess, to locate in time, to pin down? It is precisely because Sufism is carried out in every community and at every time that it has such diversity, and this is one of its secrets. The Sufi does not need the mosque, the Arabic language, litanies, books of philosophy, even social stability. The relationship with humanity is evolutionary and adaptive. The Sufi does not depend upon his repute of being able to perform magic or miracles. This is less than incidental, though he may have that reputation. The magico-religious practitioner of other systems starts from the other end of the scale. His reputation is built upon his miracles, and probably sustained by them. The Sufi has a reputation, but this is secondary to his work, his being as a part of the Sufi organism. The moral ascendancy, or the magnetic personality which the Sufi attains is not his goal, but the byproduct of his inner attainment, the reflection of his development. A Sufi says, "The moth, if it could think, might well believe that the candle flame is desirable because it seems to represent perfection. The flame is the product of the wax, the wick and the spark which kindles. Is the human moth seeking the flame or the spark itself? Observe the moth. His destiny, to be destroyed by the flame, is visible to you and hidden to him." Tongue of the Dumb, quoting Payasim. He is, of course, judged by the world at large only in light of what he says and does. Supposing that he has become a millionaire. The outside observer, realizing that this man has become a millionaire since he embarked upon a way of life called Sufism, may look upon the phenomenon as a millionaire-producing process. To the Sufi in question, however, it is the inner realization and evolution which has given him his inner attainment. The money may be an outward reflection of it, but this is of far less account than the Sufic experiences. This does not mean, as many people would assume, that he has become a millionaire obsessed by mysticism, and that money has no meaning for him. Such a development would not be possible for a Sufi, because the material and the metaphysical are linked in a form best regarded as a continuum. He would be the kind of millionaire who is not only rich, but also completely psychologically integrated. It is difficult for many people to absorb this fundamental fact sufficiently well for it to be of any use to them. In the popular practice, current from Calcutta to California, the ordinary person will rise to the philosophical heights of repeating sagely to himself, or anyone who will listen, that money is not everything, or that money does not bring happiness. The very fact that such an idea can be voiced shows that it is rooted in a previous assumption that money can be considered to be, in some way, of transcendental importance. Practice shows that it is not, but the homespun philosopher cannot grasp why this might be. The penniless man's most pressing problems seem soluble by money. The priest tells him that money is not a good thing. When he gets money, he may not as a result feel fulfilled. And these three factors he is incapable of integrating. Modern psychology has done some good, where, for instance, it has pointed out that the urge to make money may be a symptom of insecurity. But it has not yet integrated itself. Historically, it is still struggling sometimes against the tide. The Sufi attitude starts to operate on a different basis. All life is struggle, says the Sufi, but the struggle must be a coherent one. The average man is struggling against too many things all at once. If a confused and incomplete person makes money or becomes a professional success, he still remains a confused and incomplete person. Psychology learns as it goes along. Sufism has already learned. It transforms the mind from its natural and acquired incoherence into an instrument whereby human dignity and destiny may be carried a stage further. Freudian and Jungian psychology have not the freshness to the Sufi mind which they have conveyed to the West. Freud's sexual arguments are noted by the Sufi Sheikh Ghazali in his Alchemy of Happiness, written over 900 years ago, as being standard among Muslim theologians. The Jungian archetypal theory did not originate with Professor Jung, but was stated by the Sufi master Ibn al-Arabi, as Professor Rom Landau notes in The Philosophy of Ibn Arabi, New York, Macmillan, 1959, page 40 and following. Sufis of all orders are steeped in Ghazali's Alchemy of Happiness and Ibn al-Arabi's works, and hence they are familiar with these supposedly modern modes of thinking and their limitations. Sufism is not susceptible to study through psychology for several reasons. The most interesting of these to the Westerner will probably be that Sufism is itself a far more advanced psychological system than any which has yet developed in the West. Neither is this psychology Eastern in essence, but human. It is unnecessary to affirm this fact without support. We may mention Jung's admission that Western psychoanalysis is only that of a beginner compared to that of the East. Psychoanalysis itself and the lines of thought to which it gives rise, surely a distinctly Western development, are only a beginner's attempt compared to what is an immemorial art in the East. C.G. Jung, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, London, 1959, pages 250-51. And yet Jung has referred only to certain parts of Eastern thought. The whole cannot be studied by means of the parts, and the beginner cannot judge the work of the adept in any field, Sufism included. The so-called scientific approach to the human phenomenon and man's relationship with the rest of being is every bit as limited as ordinary philosophy. Like discursive reason, science operates only within the convenient circle of what fits in with its preconceptions, as Professor Graves reminds us. Scientists are careful to express their suppositions in mathematical formulas, which, applied artistically to such problems as the structure of the atom or the inner temperature of stars, give beautiful results. They are applied only to safe, prepared cases, though remaining unworkable in unstereotyped ones. There must be a sympathetic equivalence between formula and case. A beautiful result is as good as a demonstrable proof, and can be superseded only by a still more beautiful result. Robert Graves, The Crowning Privilege, London, 1959, pages 306-7. Again, the doctrine that the whole cannot be studied by means of the parts, plus the fact that a thing cannot study all of itself simultaneously. The Sufi master Piri Sarah says, "Can you imagine a mind observing the whole of itself? If it were all engaged in observation, what would it be observing? If it were all engaged in being mind, what would do the observing? Observation of self is necessary while there is a self as distinct from the non-self part." Mountain of Illumination, 16, verses 9951-57, ms. The Sufis affirm that the organism known generally as Sufism has been the one stream of direct, evolutionary experience which has been the determining factor in all the great schools of mysticism. In order to verify this as far as possible, there is some interest in following the movement of Sufic ideas. If they prove to have a penetrative power, an ability to influence thought and action in diverse communities, the inner dynamism of the system can very well be inferred. Is there, in other words, reason to suppose that the Sufic stream has the power to influence human thinking in, say, Western Europe. During the fairly well-documented classical period of Sufism, has it penetrated through the screen of the Dark Ages, providing power and development for communities which have a different background? Is Sufism organic in this respect? This suggestion implies that, from remote times, Sufi masters have transmitted their law into almost every society. Sufi tradition claims that this has been the fact. In more modern times, this claim can only be tested by the visible appearance of Sufic practices in communities far removed from the Sufi centers of Asia. The essence of Sufi activity would not be so visible. All that one could hope to find would be traces here and there, like the radioactive tracers sometimes injected into the human bloodstream, of characteristic Sufi law and practice which still maintained its local color. Take an example. If Alfonso the Sage wrote in Arabic, this might be evidence of Arabian influence. If, however, the symbol of a Sufi initiatory society were found among the Irish of the 9th century, it was, this might, with other evidence, point to a drift of Sufic law to the west. We have looked at certain outstanding characteristics of Sufism, but have not noted in starker relief the need for the superficially plausible facts of Sufi expression. Here, then, as near as they may be transmitted by ordinary words, are the rest of Sufi convictions. Sufis believe that, expressed in one way, humanity is evolving to a certain destiny. We are all taking part in that evolution. Organs come into being as a result of the need for specific organs, Rumi. The human being's organism is producing a new complex of organs in response to such a need. In this age of the transcending of time and space, the complex of organs is concerned with the transcending of time and space. What ordinary people regard as sporadic and occasional bursts of telepathic or prophetic power are seen by the Sufi as nothing less than the first stirrings of these same organs. The difference between all evolution up to date and the present need for evolution is that for the past 10,000 years or so, we've been given the possibility of a conscious evolution. So essential is this more rarefied evolution that our future depends upon it. It can be called learning how to swim, in the words of our fable. How are these organs developed? By the Sufi method. How do we know that we are developing them? Only through experience. In the Sufi system there are a number of stages. The attainment of these stages is marked by an unmistakable, if ineffable, experience. This experience, when it comes, activates the organ in question, gives us a relief from our climb upward, and grants us sufficient strength to continue the climb. The attainment of stages is permanent. Until one of these stages has been reached, the photographic plate, as it were, may have been exposed and developed, but has not been fixed, and actual experiences are the fixative substance. This is the meaning of mystical experience, which, however, when indulged in without proper harmony with evolution, seems merely to be something sublime, a sensation of omnipotence or of grace, but no assurance of where the happy or unhappy mortal is going next. Sufis believe that Sufic activity produces and concentrates what might be termed a centrifugal or magnetic force. The force calls to similar force elsewhere. With the coming together of such forces, work continues. This is an explanation of the mysterious messages which Sufi teachers get, telling them to repair to such and such a place in order to respond to the call of the force there which has become derelict, in the sense of being abandoned, or needs their reinforcing. This is as far as anything in Sufism can be explained in formal terms. As for the rest, the only valid thing is the Sufic watchword. He who tastes not, knows not. Rumi. The Subtleties of Mullah Nasruddin. When you arrive at the sea, you do not talk of the tributary. Hakim Sanai, The Walled Garden of Truth. Mullah, or Master Nasruddin, is the classical figure devised by the dervishes, partly for the purpose of halting for a moment situations in which certain states of mind are made clear. The Nasruddin stories, known throughout the Middle East, constitute, in the manuscript The Subtleties of the Incomparable Nasruddin, one of the strangest achievements in the history of metaphysics. Superficially,